So I, like most people, saw the poster for Blitz and instantly rolled my eyes in annoyance, since every fucking historical drama that comes out nowadays is just shit race-baiting propaganda that lies about history, and of course Blitz is no different. It's yet another dogshit movie that seeks to subvert a very important moment of British history and uses it as a means to virtue signal and lecture the audience about modern social issues.
Oh, fuck off.
I don't even know why this film is called Blitz, since the story is that of a little black boy who is trying to find his way home, and on the way he comes face to face with non-stop racism from the white British public. The British are shown to have no redeeming qualities whatsoever. It depicts them as backwards, selfish people who have to constantly be reminded by the non-white people to behave like actual human beings.
This is for English people. Move over.
I'd like to think that we step up to the occasion and see our fellow human beings as equals.
Now, the reason why Steve McQueen made this shit movie was because he wanted to deconstruct the heavily romanticised version of the Blitz, which is the keep calm and carry on attitude that most people associate it with, and replace it with a much more realistic depiction of the times. And while it's true that the Blitz has been looked back on with rose-tinted glasses, as there was a lot of crime and misery that most people don't talk about, he himself is guilty of doing the same exact thing, as he misrepresents entire groups of people, depicting all white men as evil, irredeemable scum, and distorts real historical events in order to push his anti-white narrative. Yes, Blitz is entirely about racism, and there is zero nuance in the story. The subject matter is treated with such carelessness and contempt that Steve McQueen ends up becoming a complete hypocrite and actually undermines his own message, because by depicting white people as cartoonishly evil, the film actually dilutes the sacrifices, pain and suffering that the average person went through and makes a complete mockery of the British people. This is a fucking joke and incredibly insulting as well, since black American soldiers and staff were treated way better in the UK compared to the US.
Well, we were well received by all of the English. Birmingham or wherever, whatever city we visited. Some of the Americans carried that segregation right over there, but the English were not that way. They appreciated us. They treated us royally.
Now, I'm not going to say that the British weren't racist, fucking everyone was, but this film doesn't want to have an adult examination on 1940s Britain. It has an agenda it wants to push and won't allow simple things like facts and good writing to get in the way of that. Another problem is the depiction of London, as this is set in the 1940s and yet the entire city looks like modern London after years of uncontrolled immigration. It's unbelievably diverse, which is just fucking ridiculous. This piece of shit propaganda is a chore to get through, as every 5 minutes Steve McQueen practically waterboards the audience again and again with the most heavy-handed, unsubtle messaging you can imagine.
You look like my dog. Where's your tail? Going to mummy, you black bastard, you.
What are you doing with that monkey anyway? Go on, skate.
But she's damaged goods, isn't she? She's got that little monkey to look after.
It is blacked out. Please turn off your lights.
This is for English people. Move over.
Oi! Should get rid of a lot of them. Bloody scallywags.
Well, it takes one to know one.
The best way to describe Blitz is that it's nothing more than racist victim fetish porn for film critics to wank off to. It's why racism takes up most of the movie's screen time instead of, you know, the actual fucking Blitz, which is what this movie is supposed to be about. Anyway, because I'm getting a fucking headache, I'll move on. Blitz has many problems besides the obvious, such as the dialogue being preachy, cliché and forced, the plot is filled with contrivances, the characters are all bland, boring and uninteresting, especially George, the main character, who has one facial expression for everything. George just sulks for most of the movie and barely reacts to or comments on the situations going on around him. He has zero personality and is not remotely likeable, which is a major problem considering that the film desperately wants us to care about him. The movie's pacing also drags as well, as it has two storylines that don't complement each other. The main storyline, of course, follows George, who is basically Pinocchio. He is a boy who is supposed to grow out of his innocent boyhood and learn about real life's hardships and struggles as he makes his way back home in war-torn London. The problem is that George is mistreated even before the Blitz, and so he and his negative perception of Britain never changes. He remains the same blank-faced, boring, dull character that he was at the beginning. He doesn't grow, nor does his view of people change. He just drifts from one scenario to the next with no real agency. Every other side character is way more engaging than he is, most of whom are only on screen for about 5 minutes as well. The other main character that we follow is his mother Rita, who just loiters around and meanders for most of the movie, as Steve McQueen doesn't quite know what he wants to do with her. She, like George, is mostly used to highlight the bigotry of the British people and complains about missing her son every 20 seconds. She is functionally useless as she doesn't push the story forward and feels more like filler to pad out the runtime. One positive I will say is that the cinematography is decent, that's it. The soundtrack is not rememberable, the writing is shallow and thinks it's way deeper than what it actually is, and by the end of it all I thought was, why the fuck have I wasted 2 hours of my life just to be lectured to by some rich dickhead who invented a story just to feel better about himself? This movie has taken World War II, the greatest war in human history, and turned it into a giant virtue signalling lecture. Suffering was universal, not to a specific race, Steve, you bald fuck. Anyway, here is what Steve McQueen calls a plot. The film starts with George, his mother Rita, and his granddad hiding in an underground shelter as an air raid is happening. The granddad manages to convince Rita that she should relocate George to the countryside for his own safety, and she agrees. But on the day, George kicks off on his mother for feeling abandoned, so he gets on the train without saying goodbye. It's from here that we have two separate storylines, one that follows George whilst the other follows Rita, and both are fucking dreadful. So George, on the way to the countryside, has two white boys being racist to him. But do you know who comes to his defence? That's right, it's a little white girl.
Leave him alone.
Christ, who wrote this?
George then has a flashback to before the war where he's playing with other white boys, and of course one of them has to say something racist, but that's only because they're jealous of him for being a much better cricket player.
Going to mummy, you black bastard, you.
This makes George upset, and so he starts to miss his mum. Regretting that he didn't say goodbye, George proceeds to jump off a moving train, which isn't locked for some reason, and tries to head back to London. He hitches a ride on another train where George finds three brothers that are also attempting to do the same thing that he is. They become fast friends, but on the way, the train stops at a nearby station where they have to try and escape the train conductor. They manage to get away by crossing multiple train tracks, but one of the boys ends up being hit by a train.
Oh no! Anyway, last week...
George barely reacts to this and just leaves the kid behind to get on a nearby bus that is conveniently heading to London. The death of this kid is the first time he's experienced such a thing directly, and yet it doesn't impact George at all. In fact, the movie just pretends that the whole situation never happens, as the next time we see him, he's not even sad.
That's fucking stupid.
We then cut to Rita, who is working at a munitions factory, where she also performs a song live for the BBC. But afterwards, a bunch of feminists rush the stage and start complaining live on air that the government won't open enough underground train stations for them to hide in. Rita, like George, then has a flashback to when she met his dad, and of course there's going to be more racism.
Oh my god!
On the way home from dancing, he is attacked by a bunch of white dudes before the police show up, who of course arrest him, not the attackers.
I don't give a fuck.
Again, what the fuck does any of this have to do with the Blitz? Oh, that's right, nothing, because the movie isn't about the Blitz. It's just one giant fucking lecture. So, back to the present. That night, she goes out drinking with her friends, one of whom wants to cheat on her husband whilst he's away fighting.
What about Dave? What about Dave? He's overseas.
What you don't know, it ain't gonna hurt him.
Keep your voice down.
Now isn't that nice? Imagine that. You're a man in France fighting for your life as all the friends you enlisted with have been turned into Swiss cheese, and the only thing that keeps you going is the thought of getting back home to your girl. Unbeknownst to you, however, your girlfriend has become the local bicycle everyone takes for a ride. Now I will give credit to where it's due, because Blitz highlights a point that I wish more war films would, which is that a lot of women were pretty unfaithful to their husbands and carried the bastard spawn of another man's seed, which they would then lie about to the husband and tell him that he is the father. It's a pretty common horror story that almost no one mentions, but at least this movie approached the subject, so I will give it one positive for that at least. So as I said, they go for a drink, and because we went 30 seconds without racism, what do you know, we have yet another incident of racism.
I am shocked. Shocked! Well, not that shocked.
Now it's here where we are introduced to a soldier called Jack, and Jack is the only white male that the movie doesn't actively spit upon. And can anyone tell me why? Well, it's because he likes Rita and will do anything she tells him to all movie, and he expects absolutely nothing in return. Yes, Jack is a full-blown simp, an OnlyFans subscriber before there was an OnlyFans. For example, at the bar, his friend warns him about getting close to her, as she has a black kid who he calls a monkey.
She's got that little monkey to look after.
So what does Jack do? Why, of course, being the good little white boy he is, Jack flies into a simp rage as he wants to fight his friends for dishonouring his queen. Anyway, this whole incident ends up being a giant waste of time as nothing ends up happening.
Who gives a shit?
Afterwards, Rita decides to help out at an air raid shelter ran by a Jewish midget called Mickey Davies, or Mickey the Midget for short, a real-life person who did such a thing. He goes on to give thanks to all the men and women fighting the fascists.
And our brave servicemen and women that are fighting for our liberty.
Yes, thank God for all those women on the front lines bashing the fascists. Without them, who knows how World War II would have ended. Yes, I know about the Russian female snipers, who doesn't? It's the only example anyone ever gives of women fighting in World War II, and do you know why? It's because most of the men were dead, so yeah, they are the exception that proves the rule, not the other way round. Also, did anyone else notice that, again, it's a Jewish man who just so happens to have a network of tunnels underground? Every single time. Anyway, back to George. He arrives in London and is still trying to find his way home until he comes across an exhibit for the British Empire. Now, can anyone possibly guess what is going to happen next? Yes, it's time for more racism. George gets to learn about the slave trade before being told to fuck off by a white police officer. But luckily for him, there is a black policeman called Ife nearby who's here to help. Oh look, another example of a British man being evil and the non-white person is a guardian angel. What a fucking shock. They walk for a bit before George goes on to ask Ife the world's most dumbest question.
Are you black?
Are you fucking retarded?
George is either colourblind or an absolute retard, as immediately afterwards he says this.
I'm not black.
What the fuck is this dialogue?
Why is everyone so fucking stupid?
Anyway, George tells Ife that his dad was deported before they go on to tell a white man that he needs to turn his lights off as it's blackout, and of course this is his reaction. Wow, this movie really likes to make the same point over and over again now, doesn't it? So another air raid happens and Ife takes George underground, where once again we see yet another case of racism.
Daring today, aren't we?
Blitz is the most self-indulgent, repetitive, boring shite that I've ever seen.
Oh God, I'm so bored.
This incident involves an English couple complaining that they have to sleep next to a Sikh or an Indian man, who cares which, calling him not English and putting up a sheet between them. The other guy is offended by this because he thinks that's segregation. This whole scene is just an excuse for Ife to take it down and lecture the white English couple.
And that we treat each other with compassion and respect.
I mean, you are a real boring fuck.
Moving on, George is put to bed, but the next morning he learns that Ife died in the middle of the night trying to save someone, so he decides to run away from the shelter and into the city. He comes across a pastry shop but gets chased away by the white owner, so of course a black woman has to lecture him. She goes on to feed George, but in actuality she's luring him into a building so that she can force him to join a gang led by a man called Albert. Don't worry though, she ends up becoming a good person in the end, as we wouldn't want those diverse characters to feel like real people now, would we? Albert is a gangster and a traumatized man who uses kids to steal from recently destroyed houses. The problem is that the plot does next to nothing with him, as after the bombing of a jazz club, Albert is distracted when playing with a dead body and George just runs away. He bumps into the black woman who fed him before, but she pretends not to notice him and lets him slip away because she actually cares about him now, despite knowing him for less than a day.
Well, that's just silly. Silly, yes. Idiotic, yes.
That same night, air raid bombings intensify, so Rita goes back to her shelter and George takes refuge in an underground train station. He ends up being stuck with a bunch of horrible white people that behave like animals, as they treat the authorities like entitled brats, and even going so far as to fuck on the train tracks in full view of everyone, including kids.
What the fuck am I watching?
George goes to sleep and dreams of a much more diverse, better station, a multicultural station where black and white people all get along and watch white women on stage sing songs to them. And of course, in the super diverse train station, everyone just gets along splendidly. Unfortunately, his delusion is disrupted by a bomb which has managed to burst all the water pipes in the station and is now causing a flood. This part of the movie is based on the real-life tragedy of the Balham underground disaster, where a lot of the station collapsed in on itself, blocking every exit and drowning the people within. But Steve McQueen, being the absolute dickhead that he is, uses this disaster in order to get his message across.
You're an asshole!
So the gate blocking the only way out was locked by the train staff. They seem to have forgotten where they put the key. So George, the black kid, who every white person has treated so very poorly throughout the movie, has to come to the rescue of all these racist white people. And he does this by slipping through a narrow gap in the gate before running off to get help.
I hate so much about the things that you choose to be.
Yes, Steve McQueen has just exploited the death of 67 people, all so that he can virtue signal and make George into the little black saviour of the racist white people.
This is gay. This is really gay.
Anyway, the film then ends with all the white people giving thanks to little black Jesus before he finally returns home and meets his mother. But their reunion is an unhappy one, as it turns out that his granddad was killed in the Blitz. The end.
Well, that was fucking dreadful.
This film is a fucking disgrace, and the reason why it's so poorly written is because the director is obsessed with lecturing the audience about race rather than trying to tell them an interesting story. When all of your characters are nothing more than mouthpieces for you to push a stupid fucking message across, then how could the audience possibly care about any of them? What shocks me most is just how badly Steve McQueen handled this entire subject when he himself made 12 Years a Slave, which was a movie that directly dealt with the slave trade, and yet the topic and all the characters in that movie were handled with so much more nuance and maturity than this shit. But that was 2012 when the movie came out, and a lot has changed since then. He has clearly drunk the Kool-Aid and now has a problem with white people, as we can see from a comment he made back in 2020 when visiting a television set in London. He complained that there was simply too much whiteness around him.
What are you, gay?
He cries racism whenever he gets the opportunity to, and because of that, his work has become overtly political. I have lost any and all respect for Steve McQueen. I mean, to go from 12 Years a Slave to Blitz, which has got to be one of the worst World War II movies that I've ever seen, is a fall from grace if ever I've seen one. But that's because it's not a World War II movie. No, it's nothing more than anti-white racist porn designed to rewrite history for a woke audience. It's a completely bullshit history that deserves nothing more than to be treated like the pile of shit that it is. Anyone who says that this movie is good deserves to be sterilised, because mongoloids of that magnitude should not be allowed to reproduce. Anyway, this propaganda piece was Blitz, a fucking atrocious movie.
It's a piece of shit.